truth. All men are not created equal. When I was 4 years old, I learned that some kids have more power than others. But that won't hold me back. If anything, it pushes me to do better. That's one huge supervillain!
My Hero Academia is a Japanese manga made by a Japanese person for other Japanese people. However, unlike its contemporaries, it tends to appeal more to those who think Gen Z is trying to cancel Eminem.
Gen Z's trying to what?
Younger to middle-aged white people who either fiend for a same-sex lover and find solace in a one-sided relationship that realizes the deepest trenches of their carnal desires, or people who are willing to praise the worst writing ever because of themes and such. What? Now, I have no idea where these people came from. What compels those who fetishize gayness or celebrate mediocrity to come to MHA and have their lives changed forever? One would have to look at MHA's influences, but to be honest with you, I don't think I know what those influences are. What is Spider-Man most known for? Honestly, being a complete mess. His school life is filled with melodrama. His romance history is as sticky as his webs are. Pause. His stories are less so about the people he beats up and more so how badly his life and his self-esteem can beat him up. One of the most recent outings of the character literally deals with whether or not he should be allowed to have basic happiness. So when I hear that Hori takes influence from the terrible life of Peter Parker, and then I turn MHA on and see blue skies, rainbows, and the story validating every decision Deku makes, I start to feel like something is missing. I say that to say, when you look at the world of MHA, the grittier, more messy elements that make up a superhero story are gone. These kids aren't in an action comedy that operates more like a soap opera. The world is squeaky clean and everyone is just so kind to each other. And when they're not, well, they better learn to be or die.
I am the least racist person you have ever interviewed.
I want you to think about what people hated about Zack Snyder's version of the characters. It wasn't just because Superman didn't smile, Batman killed people, and Wonder Woman was played by a Zionist. The reason for the mistaste was always that it took the lovable stories, tropes, and tone that was associated with that medium and turned it on its head for the sake of a specific vision that just didn't work for the types of stories it was taking inspiration from. Similarly, My Hero and the generation of shonen it comes from has an obsession with subversion. Why do these authors choose to take away what's always worked and do something completely different? Because these Gen Xers and Millennials grew up with acts like the Big Three, Hunter x Hunter, Dragon Ball, and want to expand on what they loved and fix what they didn't. And ironically, it seems to a lot of people, including myself, that gimmick is getting old. Because while MHA sets out to both subvert the Big Three era of shonen and play off well-beloved comic book conventions, and frankly isn't confident enough about itself to pull it off, and also too subconscious of itself to take risks. So instead, we have a manga that just ends up being like any other shonen and comic book, but worse. And I realize that Hori talks a lot about the Big Three when it comes to inspiration. Furthermore, looking at the types of things Hori used to draw in his free time, he is most obviously a nerd. However, in an interview, Hori states that his love for superheroes is very surface level, which is either a blatant lie or this idiot really made a series based off something he's never really cared for. Which, to be honest, I can easily see both being true. Because My Hero is anything but a homage to superhero media, or what shonen used to be. It is a culmination of someone deciding to depict a messy world and being too afraid to follow through. And now that it's over, it unfortunately can't be anything more.
From a very early point in a series, people quickly are able to realize whether or not a story is made for them. In My Hero Academia's case, myself and others were able to recognize that as early as episode 2. A superhero anime during the hype of Marvel was a pretty good idea looking back on it, but naturally, you'd have to offer a lot more outside of the profession similarity. Right off the bat, MHA set this very emotional tone that ended up rallying a lot of people behind the series. I'd argue that it's a bit tricky trickier to get somebody to cry over a series than it is to get someone to jump out of their chair as the hype possesses them. But MHA somehow accomplished both. A young man who yearned for one opportunity, and when the greatest of all time bestows him that one chance, you can't help but get teary-eyed. The feeling of having a dream, and that dream being validated, especially at such a young age. Over the course of MHA's story, we were constantly met with moments that would have us on the edge of our seats or buried nose deep in tissue. The iconic "You Too Can Become a Hero" moment, Deku vs Todoroki, All Might's final smash, anything related to Eri, heck, even Shigaraki's origin had people messed up inside. My Hero Academia decided one day that it wanted to grow up, to mature. It realized it had to. You can't have a story this rich in potential and not capitalize on it, even if that potential brings you to ever darker places. And the series went to darker places and allowed the cast to face reality, whether that be from the rampage of a monster or the destruction of an inner circle via a villain who, despite everything, still desired to help deep within himself, or even through the elaborate call-out that was Dabi's dance. Ever since Eri was stolen from greener pastures and suffered because she couldn't fathom that she was worth anything through the extortion of an ex-pro's autonomy and the isolation that Deku thought was necessary, the series was growing up with its audience. You could say that it was maturing past the golden age of comics. My favorite arc in the series is the Paranormal Liberation War, not simply because of the fights, but more so for what it stands for in the bigger picture. While still embracing such a heavy clash of emotions, it managed to represent the growing animosity of a flawed society reaching to a boiling point. This wake-up call being catastrophically served straight to the citizens who were plagued with a bystander mentality, and you can't help but love this arc, especially when reflecting on the building blocks established before we reached it. MHA really did take its time building up such a monumental climax, and that thoroughness is why Act 1 and 2 resonated with so many. Both the highs and the heavier moments delivered and constantly kept us coming back each year, but in between the emotional context and nuanced messages, there lies a meaningful connection from both the characters to us and among themselves. It helps that these moments are elevated by such powerful OSTs coming from Yuki Hayashi himself. The use of a well-constructed ambience alongside such relatable circumstances for the cast that torched our heartstrings is a recipe for success, and you saw that recipe yield positive results from the community. Even though the MHA community gets a lot of flack for its more freak-ass nature at times,
Seriously, what the f is wrong with you?
buzz around the series for a long time was consistently positive. Reactors especially being the best showcase of how the general audience felt at home, as they would not hesitate to scream or cry when some of the most series-defining moments would take place. Almost every season there was that one episode, whether it be in the middle or the finale, that takes everyone on the most insane 25-minute ride they'll witness in said year. Season 2 especially replays in my mind till this day, as if there is a moment that truly put this series on the map, it's definitely Deku vs Todoroki. Even with the manga, I don't think a soul will ever forget the day the leaks for Dabi's dance dropped and how it outtrended the presidential election that evening. Even the movies were another way for people to get together and celebrate the show. Just more proof of how invested people were and how successful the series had become. There are so many moments that you truly just had to be there for, and for somebody like me who has been there every step of the way, all I've gotten were unforgettable memories and experiences that I never thought I'd get.
Inji Todoroki is someone who perfectly encapsulates the quirk he was assigned, because fire often represents anger, passion, destruction, and sometimes change. Being filled with anger and Endeavor's view on the world, on what it meant to be a hero, were slightly tainted, leading Endeavor into obsession. Obsession over overcoming All Might, obsession over continuing his legacy, obsession over power, and approval. The reason mostly being that Hero Society rewards people like Endeavor. It's a system that's set up to praise and often exploit those with power, leading someone like Endeavor to see heroism as competition or an achievement rather than a genuine means to actually, saving lives. And at this point within MHA, it's no mystery to the readers at least that what Endeavor did to his family was absolutely horrible and far from a mistake. Like, honestly, we need this nigga hung by jumper cables. However, abuse isn't something you just kinda do by accident. Inji had intention behind his action. Through slow, gradual progression, Inji Todoroki has to come to terms with the virtue of forgiveness and acceptance. But not in the way you would probably think, because the cycle of abuse is ever present throughout the story, not only for Endeavor and his upbringing, but also as it carries out onto the other members of the Todoroki family. This topic is very personal because just like many things in society, it's not as black and white as some would probably think. Like, yeah, most people would definitely agree what Endeavor did was objectively wrong, but similarly to the treatment of his family in present day, Endeavor has also faced signs of slight trauma within his own upbringing. With witnessing the death of his father at a young age, one would imagine that that's quite mentally taxing for a kid to witness. Experiencing great loss can have a crazy effect on a youth's mental state, resulting in confusion, repressed emotion, or in Endeavor's case, possible grief brought on through obsession or anger. And while that doesn't excuse Endeavor's actions in the slightest, there is a possibility that those events sparked something in young Inji's mind, perhaps sparking something or strengthening a rage that was probably already there. But whatever the initial cause may be, tension, intent, reconciliation, and peace are still the four constant variables in this family's cycle and are the main key components for Endeavor's inevitable road to atonement. Another thing Horikoshi did very well in early MHA was show the humanity in all of the members of the Todoroki family, each member reacting in different ways to said abuse, because as individuals that's kinda to be expected. As any family, I would assume they aren't a hive mind. Class 1A. And I applaud Horikoshi for, at the time, being aware enough to handle a topic as serious as this one, with a much needed sense of respect and maturity that I believe that it deserves, because it's directly tied to that of the ethics of the human condition. It showcases how, despite our similarities, due to circumstance, we all face reality similarly, yet differently at the same time. And especially with hero society, that reigns even more true. As a result of his hyper-obsession, Inji forced his eldest son to the brink, Toya Todoroki. Of course, there was a bit of drawback due to quirk usage, but just like everything else in Inji's life, the damage was already done. And that obsession led to the kid feeling a lack of self-worth, feeling the need to prove himself to his father's standard. But after an incident leading to Toya's quote-unquote death, you'd think Inji would stop, but no. And I think what's so important about the creation of Dabi is that while his experience doesn't justify killing innocent people, his life developed through many factors of negligence and trauma. His story should be an unmoving stain on the lives of both Endeavor and society itself, as a constant reminder of the imperfections and suffering their world brings by simply existing as it does, which perfectly weaves into the effects the League of Villains have on Dabi.
In many ways, Dabi is the result of Toya desperately seeking validation, a chance to be properly seen and heard,
and the tragic consequences of such an obsession when poorly supervised and misguided.
Dabi is born as a way to shut away that boy who was neglected and to cut himself off from the world, as he's left with nothing but hate and a thirst for vengeance. And so, the reason why his relationship with the League works so well is because Dabi finally finds people who he can open up to, people who he can let his guard down with since he knows they won't reject, fear, and ignore him as his family did. His moment with Toga is so great because it's the clearest instance of this. Having endured so much with the League, he now feels comfortable showing parts of himself shaped by that past that left him so reluctant to open up in the first place. Not just open up, but to do so for the sake of another, rather than merely furthering his own quest for revenge. No longer does he refer solely to himself or hide behind Stain's ideology as a false pretense, but he straight up speaks for the League, saying things like "we" during his speech with Shoto, as a way of showing he's not exclusively fighting for his own goals. It's a pretty small part of his character, but it does go to show how great an idea the League really was. Everyone in the group has unique and evolving relationships with other members that beautifully capitalize on the potential of antagonistic groups, potential that is so rarely seized amongst MHA's peers. So it really breaks my heart to see Dabi acknowledge none of this during what's at the very least the climax of his arc. The story focuses only on his hatred of his family, while nothing comes of his growing relationship with the League, and as a result, the safest, most squeaky clean and convenient route is taken for his conclusion, a conclusion separate from the bonds he's accumulated over time.
Dabi directly ties into the parallels within the League, because their familial bond is molded entirely by the concept of shared idealism, systematic oppression, and societal corruption. And while there are lots of talks on whether or not Dabi even really cared about the League to begin with, the connection to what he was stripped of prematurely is still there nonetheless. Dabi's goals do slightly align with the League and to an extent the ideals of Stain, but his core motivator was to make Endeavor's life hell on earth, but also to open the eyes of many to the corruption a hero-centric society could produce. The impact Endeavor has on the family is still present, of course, but the effects he had on society should bounce off that concept as well. But since one is severely lacking, the other is simultaneously brought down with it. After PLW, there's a complete disregard of Endeavor's actions and the effects it had on the broader public. There is a single mention of it in Villain Hunt, but that was more so the frustration of the people, lashing out at the incompetence of the heroes as a whole, rather than Endeavor as an individual and what he did specifically. But for someone who previously handled this issue with care and nuance, now seems to be dismissing the natural human reaction of disdain and hatred one would have when realizing someone that they used to look up to was outed as, you know, an abuser. And to top it off, Endeavor till this day has faced minimal consequence for his action, just an elongated self-reflection of the growth we already knew he experienced and accepted. And, you know, he also passed out due to exhaustion, so I guess that's something. Which in my opinion is extremely underwhelming and a bit undermining of the whole point of his character arc. Although I would have preferred if Endeavor faced consequence or, you know, died or something, which honestly would have solidified his arc. But in a sense, for a lot of people, death is the easy way out, and him having to live with that is something that will haunt him forever. To a lot of people, the creation of Dabi itself is his greatest punishment.
So like, I feel like we moved on from quirks coming from AIDS too quickly. Like, yeah, I know what the story is trying to say. Quirks come not from a pure pale baby, but a prostitute who's below her peers. It says a lot about society, and yet we live in one. But like, when she starts breaking up in hives, I can't help but feel like if someone hadn't used their butt at one point, the entirety of MHA wouldn't have happened.
I have another question you won't mind me asking. Are you a squirter?
I'm not surprised. The series has been making a joke out of its own power system for a while now. I mean, when prosthetic wings are enough for you to hold your own against the devil, I think we have a problem. At one point, quirks were just muscles, a simple extension of genetics. Sure, they could carry the soul of a person, but if you're at all religious, the soul living beyond the body shouldn't even be a shock to you. But what was once glorified muscles have turned into like AI-generated virtual reality. You can view memories through another person's eyes, copy your own quirk data and keep that copy for yourself while someone else gets the real version, steal the quirk data of others even through a bullet, and if you're a real bad person, your quirks can act against you. The whole final arc is founded on the fantastical elements of quirks being heightened. If it weren't, then Deku learning of Shiggy's origins would have never happened. All for One losing battles he should clearly be winning wouldn't happen. Shigaraki growing more fingers wouldn't happen. Mr. Edging and BJ couldn't have revived Bakugo, etc. Even Monoma and Shinso being the foundation of the hero's plans wouldn't work, and don't get me started on Deku getting his arms back. Well, he might really be Hitler. I'm not interested in nitpicking the fall of MHA's power system. I mean, when your story is literally about how blue lives matter, I think I have bigger fish to fry. It's just, the vestiges were once a very personal thing. The thoughts of wills transcending time and space, it was always portrayed as very romantic. In fact, vestiges' origins, they were always metaphorical. I mean, when Naruto said you understand your opponent most in battle, I don't think he literally meant he could activate the Uchiha massacre memory within Sasuke. It was always symbolic, and whether it was the way Hori used hands, cherry blossoms to indicate a new beginning, or even simple character designs, My Hero was always subtle with that symbolism. It needed to be. Its counterparts, sure, have as much symbolism and callbacks to culture as you want. Celebrate the culture, no matter how many frauds you need to kill to do it. But MHA was always less of a celebration and more of a cautionary tale. It didn't have time to make every character a clear allegory for Sun Wukong. It didn't want to, thank God. So when it decided to make all of its imagery and symbolism more explicit, something that was once meta and is now something that could literally save the world, it tripped on itself. Because unlike its contemporaries, it was never interested enough in that symbolism to make it so it could theoretically carry a whole finale. Like, when the story says we need to pass the baton to the next generation and Mr. Edging sews Bakugo's heart together, or when the story says anyone can be a hero, which then forces All Might to get into the robots instead of staying alive so he can pass the baton to the next generation, I start to think the story is taking its themes and symbolism too seriously. Like, All Might had no family at one point, just a passion to put a stop to villainy, but he earned a family. and because of Deku's current power level, in a way his spirit has been reunited with Nana. All Might's surrogate son literally has access to his surrogate mother, but the story doesn't do anything with that potential and just puts him in a mech. You idiot! You could have done quirkless Deku from the beginning? Well crap, now it's too late. The only villains left for Deku to face are chronic loneliness and credit card debt.
This is the United Bank. Why are you here? Your bank account is cracked!
What's so weird about it is all the quirk nonsense could have easily been fixed if Stars and Stripes had any consequences on the story. Her quirk being stolen makes other quirk factors in a person act out. Have that be the reason behind All For One's inner revolt. Have that lead to a handicap for Tomura that's big enough to where Deku doesn't need to give up his power to defeat him. Or even have that be the reason why One For All and All For One can have solace within one another's dreamscape. The most we got was, like, there's a hole inside Shigaraki that Deku just needs to make wider, I guess. Though, to be completely fair to Horikoshi, I'm 100% sure that's also how the prostitute got the AIDS, so there's parallels there. Hello everyone! Welcome to the show I like to call Naya Listens, where instead of talking over the community, I give them a voice. Today marks the end of My Hero Academia, and with me I have a series veteran that I think has some insightful things to say. Please welcome my good friend Hinokami J as he...
There's no way he's quirkless, 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 there's no way...
You know what, maybe we should just cut back to the main show and give him a second. Get a grip, dude! This is my first episode!
I don't think it'd be too crazy to say that Twice truly was the heart of the League of Villains, and that for many, his relationship with the rest of the League, but especially Toga, encapsulates why the group as a whole works so well. The League is so captivating for many because their story is one about these dregs of society, these people that are unwanted, neglected, and whose suffering was ignored coming together and finding solace and clarity in that shared suffering and growing closer as a result. And Twice represented that so well with the horrible hand he was dealt in life, but his ability to remain so affectionate and caring about those close to him despite it all. He's almost this sort of beacon of hope and good who was unfortunately never given the chance to shine due to the bad hand that he was dealt. And so we do start to see the mourning of this absence through Hawks' perspective, but weirdly enough that's about it. Besides Toga, of course, who was closest to Twice, the rest of the League have nothing of interest, if anything at all, to say about Twice. There's no proper moment of mourning, no real explicit acknowledgement of his death or how it's affected the League, and while this may be acceptable for certain characters who weren't too close to him, it's particularly frustrating that Shigaraki has literally said nothing or thought nothing about this for well over 100 chapters. Despite much of his development having to do with learning to see the League not as pawns and tools only there to serve him, but rather as equal individuals who he can relate to, trust, and in doing so come to generally value and care about, we don't get to see what he thinks of the situation or what he even wishes to do about it. We don't get to see his reaction to the fact that he's lost someone he learned to generally care about. Additionally, the lack of interactions or screen time the League gets in Act 3 isn't inherently a problem and could have worked under different circumstances. However, with the way the story panned out, in hindsight, the lack of screen time feels like a series of missed opportunities and writing decisions with little to no actual purpose for the narrative. For example, when the group is at its lowest point, Toga just decides to just fuck off and nothing comes from her absence that couldn't have been accomplished with her sticking with the League. It's very weird, very confusing. And when we do get to the final arc, all the members of the League are almost immediately split up, meaning some of these members will have gone a very long time with no interaction with the others and might actually die before any type of reunion or shared mourning over Twice ever happens. And don't get it twisted, Toga isn't the only one who's affected by this lack of screen time for the League. Shigaraki is easily the most affected by Act 3's nonsense in this regard. Now, to be fair, Shiggy not having anything of interest to say about Twice isn't really his fault. After all, for most of Act 3, we're treated to essentially All For One cosplaying as Tomura through a merger. Because of this merger, Shigaraki is stripped of his agency for quite a while in the story, and when he's finally out, all he gets to do is fight Deku and then die almost immediately. He doesn't process his relationship with the League, what he went through during pre-LW, nor his origins. His only real purpose in this story is to just be a foil for Deku to save. Did MVA really need to emphasize the League's poor conditions and struggles, or end with Shigaraki amassing all this power if all of it would be irrelevant by the time we got to the final arc? We're now at the end of the series, and it's kinda sad to see how much of his growth and journey ended up being fairly inconsequential to his conclusion and final confrontation with Deku. Shigaraki brings up being the hero that the League needed, this idea of the light of hope for those who were like him and didn't have a home to be themselves in. But because the story is so hyper-focused on the idea of Tomura being a tool and nothing more, the second we're about to elaborate on this idea, All For One has to take the spotlight once again. Shigaraki is so much more than just Tenko, and it's utterly frustrating that in Act 3, the story seems to have forgotten everything else about the character just so that we can hyperfixate on that one aspect of his identity.
While I do appreciate Dabi's dance in isolation and what it did for his and Endeavor's arc respectively, I can't really help to nudge the feeling that the end result was a bit lacking. For someone like Horikoshi to constantly write about the humanity of others and the Todoroki family in particular, always showcasing the reactions and effects these events have on the characters, it feels like that midway he kinda just, forgot about that. Because nowadays, it often feels like Horikoshi is parodying himself. Whereas before, the constant cycle of abuse was nuanced and was thematically relevant in accordance to which family member was being shown. Now, it feels like Horikoshi is just hyperfixated on the concept of the family coming to terms with Endeavor just being the guy they just kinda have to deal with. If you're at all familiar with comics, the sentence, "all it takes is one bad day," should be nothing new to you. The concept of someone who lives a normal, happy, and less than stellar life having tragedy strike, which causes their mental state to do a complete 180. And while at one point my hero validated those who fell victim to the powers that be, not caring for their individuality and terrible lives, Dabi's dance and the non-existent consequences that follow, Twice's death and its irrelevance to the story, Shigaraki's revealed lack of agency, or Toga and her quest for freedom, show that the story failed to follow through with its own promised sympathy.
Instead of validating those who have suffered from the system, the story chooses to prop up the factions and people who benefit from it. The Hero Commission doesn't seem to face any changes or scrutiny and just enlists Hawks to serve as its new president, whether that's in character or not, I guess. The kids get to resume school after a war, the same school that symbolizes the very thing the villains wanted to change in the first place. And as stated before, the only consequences for Endeavor's actions are self-imposed ones. Furthermore, the story is so utterly obsessed with Bakugo that it's concerning. His arc is about realizing how special he isn't, and despite that, the story chooses over and over again to put him in a position that makes him stand out in comparison to his comrades, i.e. getting to be one of the most popular heroes ever, while Deku just gets aired in the group chat.
MHA's story seems hell-bent on talking about how we can't censor those who are outcasts of society, that their stories must be heard and that there is the possibility for them to be saved, helped, or at the very least heard in order to prevent these things from being repeated. And yet, when given the opportunity to show this with one of the League members and show how their messages have had consequences on society, the story seems content with trivializing those messages. One could go as far as saying that the story accidentally says that the line for rehabilitation, second chances, or being heard, is drawn at those who fail to be heroes, with the only people given a chance at a better life being gentle and Nagant.
We have this common idea of reaching out locked in our minds because at the core of heroism, that is what it's all about. To simply beat the bad guy never gets down to the real issues that were swept under the rug. It's hard to respond to the issues of a human's heart with logical answers, so instead we are met with some of the most captivating and desperate emotional encounters in order to connect the two sides that the framework would deem an enemy. Through the humanizing of these villains, through the curtains peeling back so that the world can see the truths of this setting, we have come to the point where what it means to save somebody has such a rich undertone within the context. We've come to love Class 1A not just because of their varying personalities and humor, but because of their willingness to reach out to each other and to the ones who really need that help.
At least in concept, because essentially what the story is saying is that this idea of helping oppressed members of society who went down a dark path can't be shown or done. It's only ever promised. And this is without mentioning how tone deaf it is to see a character emblematic of oppression and discrimination throwing her life away immediately after being given hope for a better future. Especially when it's to help someone who works with the organization whose goal has been to uphold the very system
that put her in the position she finds herself in.
One doesn't just simply throw their life away because they finally found someone that wasn't racist. But that's exactly what Toga did. It's just so fucking ridiculous, you know?
From the beginning, MHA has always set out to be a story way beyond the simple lens of the good guy beats the bad guy. One of the first things narrated by Deku is that all men are not born equal. While at the time, the first few arcs illustrated that by showing the contrast of flashy quirks versus mediocre ones, the bigger picture was really about how people end up on the side of heroes or villains. Over the course of the series, you begin to see that this hopeful story that may have come off as corny or at least not as mature as its shonen predecessors had a lot more morally gray story beats weaved throughout with the introduction of Stain and the aftermath of Camino. We had heroes who were greedy and money hungry, and we had abusers and deviants in top positions. Even the committee that oversaw how heroes operated was corrupt from the inside out. At the same time, we saw characters who, victims of this broken society, were painted as less malicious terrorists and more sympathetic outcasts. When a flawed society is held up, all it takes is one bad day for you to be deemed a villain for the rest of your life, and yet that in itself was seen as the normal.
So what about people without quirks? Sure, they can get jobs like normal people, but they're essentially ostracized from the most important and valuable job in society, a hero. Add on top, they have no special quirk that can excel in some niche field, and you have people that are an afterthought.
One for All was his solution to being quirkless, but that should have never been a problem Deku had in the first place. Society positioned young Izuku Midoriya to view being a hero and, more importantly, having a quirk as inherent to his value as a person. Deku was born quirkless, told by everyone in his life that this means he is lesser than others around him. Receiving One for All was never the solution to the real problem Izuku faced, his lack of inherent value as a person. Getting a quirk didn't magically give him this self-worth. It turned him into a vessel for something he deems far more important, the power to save people, the power of One for All. And we see as the series progresses, this dynamic and lack of self-worth unfurls as Deku's character is driven deeper and deeper into a pit of self-sacrifice. It starts with how the power of One for All affects Deku. The more he uses it without control, the more it damages him. In the beginning, he lets himself get hurt in order to use the quirk and save people. He quickly learns of ways to control this power and use it more without damaging his body, but we see that this is not a hard rule for him at all. Self-preservation becomes less and less of a necessity when other people are in danger. When it comes to saving people, he will bring himself to near death, very nearly killing himself if it means saving another person. In effect, the definition of self-sacrifice.
The sports festival, where he breaks his arms and fingers to save Shoto from his own grim perception of his power and identity. Or Overhaul, where even though he saves Eri, he still feels guilty for having to use her power. Or during the war, where he knows breaking his arms could cause irreparable damage.
And honestly, the early series portrays most of this in a very positive light. We are shown a society that is built on the foundation of being a superhero. Simultaneously, we are introduced to the superhero, one who embodies self-sacrifice, All Might. Even as Deku is told by doctors, teachers, and other heroes that he needs to preserve his own life, it doesn't stop Deku from giving his all anyway. It also doesn't stop the narrative from positioning his acts of sacrifice as almost entirely positive and triumphant, and really, why would it not? At this stage of the series, we're still viewing the story primarily from Deku's perspective, the same Deku that grew up being told he is worthless without a quirk. The same Deku that doesn't value himself in the slightest. Up until now, he's been our eyes. He's acted as not only the audience surrogate, but a conduit for everyone else to be inspired by. Everyone comes out of their relationship with Deku completely changed, and he's affected the story in more ways than he himself thinks he has, even when he's not on screen or even the focus of an arc. However, that complex dynamic between wanting to protect others, that need to love himself, the responsibility he feels regarding his duties as the next user of One for All, and his lingering self-loathing, it's all something we made up. We can spend time talking about Deku's mental health, his perspective on self-worth and One for All, the deeper workings of his character and why he acts the way he acts, and all of it is there, within the story, ready for the audience to interpret and analyze. The only problem is the story never actually capitalizes on most of this. And if that's the case, what is even the point? The Villain Hunt arc was what many, myself included, believed to be the moment in the story that was going to double down on Deku's character work. His overarching character arc that had been building up for 300 chapters at that point. And it starts off doing just that. We see Deku retreat into a sort of solitude, paralleling his predecessor and pushing everyone he cares about away from him to protect them and fulfill his purpose as the carrier of One for All. His demeanor changes. He loses the light in his eyes as he slowly becomes more of a vessel for One for All than a person. The arc starts out pretty great. It has incredible setup and a ton of amazing moments. The only problem is, before the arc can truly explore the things it sets out to say, it ends. It fails to delve into Deku's mental state, choosing to rather let the people around him do all the speaking, refusing to share his thoughts and feelings adequately. We have an entire arc focused on Deku going out on his own, and it feels like I'm digging through the panels just to see how he's thinking and feeling. And this isn't limited to Villain Hunt either. Whether it's the students speaking on behalf for Deku when it came to forgiving him, or the prospect of losing his own power explained through the vestiges, or the inability to talk himself out of his rage when he sees Bakugo dead on the ground, Deku's internal monologue, his thoughts and his feelings, are all left for other characters to put together.
The fight to find one's self-worth and improve mental health is a very active one. A person must actively choose to love oneself every day and make choices that are in the interest of their health and well-being, which is why Deku's journey of finding his own worth comes crashing down. Throughout the first 2 acts, he was incredibly active, with the story and the people around him being majorly impacted by his choices and actions. And now in the climax of his arc, all agency he has rapidly disappears in Villain Hunt, as almost everything that happens in the story is no longer influenced by his actions. How does he feel about Bakugo's apology? And how does he feel about everything that's happened between them now that he's apologized? Where do they go from here? Who cares? Horikoshi clearly doesn't. We did get to see how he felt about Ochako after her speech, but that took real-life months. And it completely skips the emotional tension that could have come out of his dispute with All Might.
Such a dramatic and important moment in the series that links both Deku and All Might's problem with self-worth and self-sacrifice, and it's resolved in less than a page with a throwaway line about friendship? And let's be honest, the same can be said about almost every other character interaction in that same chapter. Any introspection of Deku's mental problems is completely shelved here into one line of dialogue mentioning his support from his friends, glossing over his mental issues that led him to isolate himself from everyone in the first place, and removing any tension from the character's traumas and previous interactions. Effectively, Chapter 327, the conclusion and aftermath of the Villain Hunt arc, presents a band-aid solution to the very core of Deku's character, with zero promise or inclination that it will ever be meaningfully touched upon again. If this band-aid solution were to be taken seriously at all, we should be seeing it from Deku's perspective. Show us Deku's thoughts on his current situation. Show us why Deku's mental health still isn't better, or if it is, show us why it is. Don't just leave it for the reader to guess indefinitely and then never tell us. Give me Deku acknowledging his own worth. He's the Deku who always does his best, and yet we see in Villain Hunt and PLW how he clearly does not think he's ever doing enough. He's constantly afraid of being the useless Deku, so show him acknowledging to himself that he isn't. One page, one line, hell, even if he implies the idea of his own growth through dialogue with another character, all I want is a concrete acknowledgement of his growth that's more than an implication through a throwaway line about accepting help from others. The senseless mitigation of melodrama, the insistence on making reconciliation easy, the desire for the characters to stay together even if that might be more difficult after all that's happened, is indeed a solution to Deku's self-worth issues, a community of kindness and trust. But it is a solution coded in naivety. It's a solution founded not on the complicated nature of these topics, but rather a remedy, one that aims to put a band-aid on the problem. Our desire for a more nuanced exploration of Deku's thoughts and mental health is amplified by the slow burn approach the series initially promised and acted on. Instead, many of these chapters feel like spark notes, leaving us wanting so much more for the main character of the series. And I can't help but feel like if this arc were tackled how the earlier arcs of the series were written, we would have gotten a much more comprehensive and satisfying conclusion.
Deku is the person who always tries his best, and his efforts should be rewarded. He has worked hard for years to make his quirk his own. He's managed to keep kindness in his heart despite that same heart being tested over and over again. So, in my opinion, he deserves a few wins. He should succeed, though not in saving Shigaraki. Shigaraki and even Dabi up to this point are more than just people. They're ideas, the consequences of a flawed, vain hero system. They're the embodiment of hatred, and they love it. But you know who does actually deserve redemption? Well, people like Toga, Spinner, Compress, the members of the League that were silenced when given the opportunity for a better life. The life that Shigaraki and Dabi should, in my opinion, die for. So, why was it that Toga ended up dying again? Right, it's because despite all of her efforts, and the fact she probably has more introspection than the actual lead, Ochako gets relegated to background character so often that her collective power level is that of a Kyoto kid. Her and the rest of the cast, the people we spent the whole story developing, the collective that we never really cared for but were willing to put up with so the story can explore its own themes, have nothing to show for all the time we were forced to spend with them. Especially Deku's inner circle, who have learned to be stronger and more aware heroes, or so I thought, and yet they're still here. In a moment that calls back to the iconic portal scene in Endgame, they all show up, except Ochako of course, to help Deku out of his rut. In the middle of what is Deku and All For One's last bout and One For All's reunion with itself, why do they have to show up to begin with? Why do these kids keep interrupting what should be moments where Deku's allowed to question himself, his surroundings, and reevaluate his purpose? Well, maybe it's because stripped of every distraction, Deku never has anything of interest to say on his own. Every time he's forced to come to grips with someone who, let's say, gave him his self-worth issues to begin with, or endangered his loved ones, his bottomless pit of empathy gets the better of him. He doesn't think about whether forgiving people who have wronged him is short-sighted or the severity of his own trauma. He just does things. And for a story that wanted to challenge its own optimism, I can't help but feel like these plot points use that same optimism as a crutch through the main character. Especially when I have to sit there and learn this man doesn't even care that he lost his own quirk. All that time spent on him making it his own was wasted, I guess. When he talks about how he'll never forget about the villain he had to kill to protect his loved ones, the villain who was a hero to his allies, why should I care? Deku hates himself. He doesn't think his thoughts or words are worth anything, and despite the existence of his solo arc, the story hasn't properly rectified that. Because if Deku can solve every problem through crying, well, that gets us to the finish line faster. Because the author frankly doesn't want to be here anymore. But he does, because instead of showing us mercy through a Bleach-esque time skip in the final wedding chapter to satisfy, I don't know, someone, he says he wants to stay for a whole nother volume. So why? Why didn't Deku and Tomura get to have a conversation? Why doesn't Deku get to have a conversation with anyone who's wronged him? Why are you choosing now to care about the things you've off-screened for years? Things it seemed like you had no time for? It's too late. And maybe that's it. Maybe this manga doesn't realize it's too late, and not in the meta sense. I mean that it's too late for the characters that have died as a memory or should die as an ideal. I mean it's too late for the atonement of an abuser in the public eye, or to bring back a character that should have stayed on the sidelines because of the impact their powerlessness had on us as an audience. I mean it's too late for this conservative society that values complacency over real heroism. And that's okay, because at one point my hero taught me that just because it's too late for one generation, that doesn't mean the next can't get it right, can't carry on the ideals and wills of the last to ensure they don't repeat the same mistakes. But my hero never matured enough to fully realize that. Every time it attempted to, it regressed. In fact, all of the characters that helped it grow up are gone, shafted, pushed to the sidelines because the story would rather focus on Class 1A. So instead of exploring Hawks with his newfound freedom or checking up on Chisaki, we get Bakugo glazing and a mech that fixes Toshinori's arthritis. Regardless, we still have a main character who the story lets save everyone he can, to a traitor to a past bully. You want to show grace to damn near everyone, fine. So why couldn't the story give the same grace to someone like Tomura? Well, because the story doesn't want to grow past the golden age of comics. It doesn't want a villain that's actually complex. It wants antagonists you can pity. It wants antagonists that the moment you show them that you don't see color, you see character, they instantly forget what they were mad about in the first place. It wants antagonists who have their whole being flanderized, so that they can simply be sad children. And when that's not enough, it takes the embodiment of how the West wrote its villains back in the 60s and makes him the only bad guy you have to beat. The catchphrase of the series, "Go Beyond Plus Ultra," doesn't even make that much sense when you think about it, because in reality, none of these characters need to go plus ultra. The story doesn't allow them to go plus ultra, because every time they should, they're given an easy solution to their problem, and they always take it. Their optimism is rewarded. The same naive behavior the story was setting up to criticize is now a defining character trait of that same story, and now that it's over, it unfortunately can't be anything more. Wait, hold on. So you're telling me the guy who caused MHA's 2 9/11s gets to have a bullshit throwing away party, but the group of people who have faced racism and discrimination all have to die without even affecting history? See, I told you guys, Deku vs. Shigaraki is freaking hilarious. It's funny. In a vacuum, the final arc does give me things I wanted, things I've theorized for years, and things I never expected, in a good way. In isolation, as a longtime fan of the series, some of these moments do put a smile on my face. So what's the problem? Well, these moments are not only payoffs to subplots that were executed terribly, the payoffs themselves, when you think about it, were delivered in the most plain way imaginable. The story hasn't given Deku anything in years, not triumphs, not even time to think for himself. So of course he's quirkless. Why even allow him to have a dream? He didn't even get to have a proper goodbye to the Vestiges, mind you, who were only ushered further into the foreground because of the quirk nonsense I mentioned beforehand. Toga is dead. She was supposed to keep living for the League, for twice, for herself. She was supposed to see that better future. I even believed she would have a fated face-off with Hawks who could share his regrets for Jean's death. But neither character get any comeuppance despite all of the trauma and trouble they've gone through all of this time. Sure, Endeavor held Dabi so they could possibly die together, but they were both forced to live by the end. Live long enough for Dabi to shed apologetic tears for things he did out of valid societal criticisms. The discrimination subplot is tone-deaf at best, and at worst puts to rest this man's politics simply sucking because of the restrictions shown in manga innately have. Eri did fix Deku's arms as a thank you for all of his efforts, but she had to be mutilated for that to happen, and didn't even get to share the same space as him when it happened. She ironically was used as a tool by the author, the same way Overhaul used her. Shigaraki might have been revealed to have been given decay, but that didn't lead to him conquering his humanity. If anything, it only suppressed his consciousness further, which also invalidates Bakugo's efforts that didn't even need to happen if All Might didn't put himself in a mech. And sure, Deku and Ochako got to have a moment together, a brief one before Class 1A come to interrupt because of course they do, but the relationship up to this point has been nothing short of vapid. They've made no effort to connect outside of the brief conversations they have in between arcs. And sure, they've saved and inspired one another, but that hasn't translated to an on-screen consistent friendship in the same way that Deku and Bakugo have, for instance. Ain't that some bullshit? And this is how the series ends. All of the relationships Deku cultivated over his first year have done him no favors. The story says you don't need powers to be a hero, all you have to do is be someone who reaches out, and Deku does reach out as a teacher, but it's a lonely existence. Deku's friends have been shown to distance themselves from him as they grow older, and chase his dreams for him while they're at it. None of this is malicious, of course, but it's unfortunately kind of telling that the only time his friends give him the attention he deserves is when he gets his powers again, confirming that, at least on a meta level, he doesn't really matter outside of how well he can fight villains. The story ignores the lingering plot lines left loose, with no update on the League's influence on society, other classmates in Shiketsu, the leftover pros, and chooses instead to spit out their efforts and reinstate the hero charts. All the while, society seems to be worse as the title of hero is more scarce and bullying has spread to even non-quirkless kids. And the fans will never have problems with this ending, because most of the people that like this final arc are blinded by the privilege they think they've disowned by liking yaoi, and others, would be content with whatever Horikoshi decides to do out of sheer brand loyalty? What attracts the caucasus and mentally ill individual to My Hero Academia? To be honest, I still have no idea. My Hero's politics, which were at a point an avenue for minority people to relate and feel seen through, are now a shadow of what they used to be, and the fanbase seems none the wiser. Why? Because the type of audience MHA attracted wouldn't understand systemic discrimination if it made them sit in the back of the bus. The saving grace of comics is versatility. If one person mildly mischaracterizes someone, does damage to a character's setting, the next writer can fix those issues and make iconic storylines that influence generations of superhero media everywhere. But My Hero has no other writers that can fix its issues. Believe me, I tried. It has no adaptations that can streamline iconography to make it more digestible. This is the way My Hero Academia will always be. A naive tale about heroes who can't save, and villains who can't usher change. A tale about fighting discrimination, loved by fans who wouldn't function without it. A tale about how Izuku Midoriya could not become the greatest hero, because he couldn't even save himself. A tale in which, despite that, people love. And a tale that I'm happy is over.
Now let's get it all in perspective. This a dawn you with. Never did a thing, got the jails on smash. I watch the future make history. There's no competition, it's just me. Y'all can bear witness the growth of the greatest. Y'all know what time it is? It's Jimmy Iovine time. Aftermath of my rap, so shady. That nigga dog came to see. Often imitated but cannot be. The evil genius. Cause I got the keys to the city. They can trigger me, they'll never figure me out. I'm back better than ever. I done told you, nigga. You motherfuckers can never do it like I can do it. I'ma tell you what Banks told me, cause go ahead, switch the style up. If niggas hate, then let them hate and watch the money pile up.